After her mother's death, Mary Catherine, or MK, travels to her father's house out in the middle of the forest. She hopes to start fresh with her father for her late mother's sake after he allowed his marriage to fall apart because of an obsession he has with a tiny civilization that he believes exists in the forest. However, she winds up accidentally getting caught up in a struggle between the very people her father has been watching. The Leaf Men, who are protecting Tara, the queen of the forest, while she performs an important ritual to pass on her power to a pod so that the forest can go on living, and the Boggans, a group of small creatures who spread decay, who oppose them and wish to kill the forest. When Tara is shot down, she sees MK and uses the last bit of her magic to shrink her down, and then charges her with taking the pod to a safe place. From here, MK has to team up with a veteran leaf man named Ronan, a slug and a snail named Mub and Grub, and the carefree and somewhat irresponsible Nod to keep the pot away from the Boggans, so that it will bloom and the forest will continue to flourish. At the start, Epic has some promise. I like the main character, MK. From the previews, I got the impression that she'd be kind of the irritating teenager in a typical fish out of water story, but she actually had a sense of responsibility and was pretty likable. In the scene where we first see her, when she's going to her father's house, I thought her behavior was pretty believable, and she showed a surprising amount of character and maturity in the way she handled the task the Queen of the Forest gave to her. Ronan and Nod were a bit more cliche, although I still rather liked Ronan. He was your typical stoic, overly serious mentor to the less responsible and careless Nod. Nod I found way less interesting. I don't know, maybe it's just because Ronan's character type is a little more enjoyable to watch, whereas Nod's has become a bit tiresome as it's used all the time in animated movies. His character arc is painfully predictable and devoid of any innovation on the writer's part. The world they created was also rather pretty, animation was great, and there were a lot of concepts that I did enjoy. To be honest, I actually really liked the movie, for the first 20 minutes or so. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't sort of aware that it was getting some lukewarm reviews, and at first I was kind of wondering why. That was up until MK was shrunk down and the movie began to resort to what I will continue to refer to as kid movie syndrome. Of course it's for kids, right? So we need some lame comic relief that could have easily been taken out of the film. Mub and Grub's reason for being there was, what, because they needed to keep the pod moist? Yeah, they could have just written them completely out. I also was almost as turned off by Nimgaloo and his random song. Again, a clear indication of kid movie syndrome, and even that little leaf girl who kept popping up and sounded more like a typical teenager than MK did. It always throws me off when you have characters like this talking in slang or saying stuff like, "Oh man, she's like totally awesome." There are also some painfully unconvincing relationships that aren't really given the opportunity to develop naturally. Really, the strength of the film was not in any of this, or even the main plot, which devolves quickly into something that looks so absurdly close to Ferngully that I may have to put it in a future Real vs. Real. Any strength to be found in this film was in the action. Frankly, 20th Century Fox and Blue Sky should have just gone the way of something like Rise of the Guardians, and made it more about action-packed sequences rather than trying to put so many story elements, kid-friendly cliches, and relationships into it. I'm not sure the creators of Ice Age are quite talented enough to pull off a relationship between an estranged daughter and father, nor can I really say they were all that successful, but if that hadn't been enough, they also tossed in the relationship between Nod and Ronan, and Nod and MK. With all of that, it's only to be expected that most of the relationships would come across as underdeveloped. It was pretty clear by the title that we weren't going to get something really all that insightful, so the only real option was to make the kids' equivalent of an action film, like along the lines of something like Tintin. I'd much rather watch something like that than a slug playing with his eyeballs or an awkwardly developed cliché romance between two characters with little to no chemistry. And of course we get another environmental film too. Last year it was Illumination, this year's 20th Century Fox and Blue Sky. Only this time the evil force is natural death and decay? In this case I'd almost make an argument for the fact that, well, isn't this a necessary part of nature? This could have been a lot more interesting if they'd focused more on the balance between these forces, but of course, kid movie syndrome. Leafman's good, Boggan's bad. I remain convinced that one of the only ways to tell a good environmental story is without a clear villain, but I'll give Epic a reluctant pass because at least they didn't create a businessman that sells air or a guy who feeds off pollution. There were still some really good things here, don't get me wrong, but because of all of the added comic relief and predictable characters and plot lines, not to mention the odd and somewhat unconvincing relationships, this film really does fall short of being epic.